Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to CLS Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about the abolitionist movement. So slavery had been around since the dawn of time across the world. Early Egyptians had slaves, the Roman Empire had slaves, and even slavery was mentioned in the Code of Hammurabi, meaning that slavery dates back to the date of the Mesopotamians from the beginning of humanity. By the time it comes to the New World in 1619, it had been around for thousands of years. During the years of colonization, northern colonists began to oppose the institution of slavery. Abolitionists, or people who wanted to eradicate slavery, came from different backgrounds and opposed slavery for different reasons. After the United States were formed during the 19th century, opposition to slavery became more prevalent. Many believe that African Americans should be treated the same way that white Americans were treated, while some others opposed full equality under the law. By the 1830s, Americans took a more organized action supporting abolition. The invention of the cotton gin affected the cotton industry in the South more than any other invention. As the cotton industry expanded, slavery became more entrenched in Southern life, but at the same time in the North, there began a strong opposition to the institution of slavery. There were some attempts to try to mitigate slavery or even ideas to allow enslaved people the ability to leave the United States. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded to establish a colony of freed slaves in Africa. In the 1820s, funds were raised to allow some enslaved people to take a trip back to their motherland, when in 1822, Liberia was created as a haven for American slaves. Another attempt was the Compromise of 1820, or the Missouri Compromise. When Missouri applied to be a part of the Union as a slave state, Maine was created to offset the representation in Congress. It was the attempt to limit the expansion of slavery above the 3630 line, which was at the heart of the abolitionist North. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 banned the institution of slavery. Andrew Jackson refused to annex Texas because of slavery. Missouri couldn't immediately become a state because of slavery. The Great Compromise debating representation was because of slavery. The government always had to make decisions based upon the institution of slavery. During the 1800s, the government was passed a gag rule in the House of Representatives forbidding the discussion of bills that restricted slavery. Abolitionists were attacked because of their beliefs, and while northern churches rallied to the abolitionist cause, the churches of the South used the Bible to defend slavery. Many enslaved African Americans did not want to leave the United States, firmly believing that the United States was built on their backs and of their backs of their ancestors. By the mid-1800s, a majority of the enslaved people in America had not even stepped foot in Africa. Since the middle to the end of the 18th century, the North had abolished slavery, and their attempts to abolish it in the South paled in the attempts that came in the 19th century. So remember, an abolitionist is a person who wants to eradicate or get rid of slavery. The institution of slavery was able to phase out in the northern states early in the history of the United States because the northern economy and the way of life was not based upon it. There were no plantation farms in the North. There were more factories. So it should not come to a surprise that many of the abolitionists were from the northern states. In the early 1800s, a young man named William Lloyd Garrison was working as an apprentice as a writer at the Newburyport Herald, a newspaper in Massachusetts. In 1828, Garrison met a man named Benjamin Lundy, an anti-slavery editor for an emancipation newspaper. Lundy offered Garrison a job and he graciously accepted. It was here where William Lloyd Garrison realized his calling. Garrison began to write his own abolitionist newspaper called The Liberator, which spoke out against slavery and the harshness of the institution. And in 1832, Garrison helped form the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1833, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. Other prominent abolitionists during the 19th century that have been previously discussed were Angelina and Sarah Gremke. They were two Southern white women who wrote anti-slavery pamphlets and booklets, including American Slavery as It Is and Sojourner Truth. Truth was an African-American abolitionist who believed that God sent her to earth to spread the word against slavery and traveled around the United States preaching the truth about slavery and women's rights. An important fact about Truth is that she was a slave who escaped and went on to be an enormous force in the abolitionist movement. Another influential African-American abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. At the age of 21, Frederick Douglass escaped slavery and became one of the most important African-American leaders of the 1800s. Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey and took the name Douglass because he did not want to be recognized and returned to his owner. He was highly educated. In 1841, Douglass spoke to an all-white crowd in Nantucket and told him what it was like to be a slave, eventually branching out across the nation. There had been historians who believed that Douglass was never a slave. They argue that because there were laws put in place to make sure slaves would not be allowed an education, Douglass should never have been as educated as he was. Also, his expressiveness and the fact that he would not reveal his birth name caused people to believe that Douglass had been born a free man. The record is that Douglass traveled to England where a group of abolitionists had purchased his freedom and he was sent back to America to preach abolition. The narrative still stands that Douglass escaped the institution of slavery to be one of the biggest leaders of the abolitionist movement. Finally, there were other African Americans who wrote narratives about their experiences as slaves in order to expose slavery's cruelties. Now, any good cause requires men and women with grandiose ideas, and the abolitionist movement was no different. However, ideas, no matter how big the size, are not enough to make the change. Abolitionists knew action needed to be taken, and in the 1830s they organized the Underground Railroad to help enslaved Africans to the north escape to the north. The railroad was not a physical road of tracks that large transports took people from the south to the north. On the contrary, it was just the opposite. In the 1830s, a loosely organized group of abolitionists created the Underground Railroad, which had begun helping slaves escape from the South. The Underground Railroad was a network of people who arranged transportation and hiding places for fugitives or escaped slaves. White and black people alike would be conductors of the route escaping the South. Conductors would take fugitives or escaped slaves and would travel along routes leading them from the slave-owning southern states to the abolitionist northern states or even to Canada. Conductors would move the slaves from station to station, usually under the cover of darkness, to protect them from harm and being returned to their masters. If returned, slaves would experience unheard of barbarity. Stations were usually homes and churches and any safe place to rest and eat before continuing on the journey to freedom. Many times the white people would pretend to be the slave's owner for protection. Many times slaves would take the railroad by themselves, looking for the signal of the next safe place to rest their head. This was a very risky business because sheriffs and slave catchers were always on the heels of escapees and on the lookout for fugitives. Between 1830 and the end of the Civil War, more than 3,200 people were known to have worked on the Underground Railroad. Most of them will never be known for their heroics. One of the most famous and successful conductors of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. Tubman's date of birth is unknown, although it probably occurred between 1820 and 1825. She was named Armorinta Harriet Ross, nicknamed Minty by her parents. She changed her name to Harriet around the time of her marriage. Between the decade of 1850 and 1860, Tubman made 19 trips from the south to the north following the Underground Railroad. She guided more than 300 people, including her parents and several siblings, from slavery to freedom. She originally encountered the railroad when Harriet and two of her brothers attempted to run on the trail September 17, 1849. After a reward of $300 went out on their heads, her two brothers went back to the plantation and Harriet went by herself. She consistently carried a pistol on her person and would threaten to shoot anyone who had second thoughts. When the Civil War broke out, she was used as a spy because of her knowledge of the land. So slaves followed many different routes for freedom. There were these dangers around every corner for enslaved Africans. They were not certain that they would even actually obtain their freedom in the free states, and the U.S. law still considered them as property. Bounty hunters were paid to hunt them down and capture slaves and return any fugitives they found to their slave owners. Many Americans became famous because of their help on the railroad. Levi Coffin had a safe house in North Carolina in which there was a small room behind a room where the small door was covered by a bed. Despite the efforts of many abolitionists, many Americans remained opposed to ending slavery. Many white Northerners agreed with the South and supported slavery. It was kind of a, if I don't see it, it doesn't affect me. Many white Northerners felt that if slavery were to end, jobs would be taken away, and Southerners felt that if slavery was a vital part to their economy. To end the story of the abolitionist movement, we're going to discuss the story of Henry Box Brown. Henry was born into slavery on a Virginia plantation in 1815. Brown had gone to the mail post and researched the largest box was to ship, which was about 3 by 3 by 2.5 feet. Brown's friend Samuel Smith shipped a box containing Brown on March 23, 1849. The box was labeled dry goods and handled with care, and it was lined with cloth and had a single hole cut in the top of it for air. All Brown had was a few crackers and a small portion of water. 27 hours after leaving Virginia, the box arrived in Philadelphia at the headquarters of the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society. Against many abolitionist wishes, Brown made his escape public, and in 1850, with the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, Brown moved to England. So as you can see, the anti-slavery movement in the years of 1840, 1850, 1860 really start to pick up steam. And that's where we're going to go into the next chapter. We're going to talk about the division of our country, and then we're going to lead into the Civil War. I'll see you next time.